If you think I'm too old to see through your little games, Marco, then you're dumber than I gave you credit for. Those were the words that scorched his smug grin off his face like a blowtorch. But that moment, the moment I ripped the mask off their scheme, came much later. Back at the beginning, I was just a woman trying to survive the quiet. My name is Marisol Vega. I'm 55 years old, and I have lived through grief that could have sunk a lesser person into the earth. 3 years ago, my husband Javier died suddenly, leaving me with our sprawling vineyards in Valencia, olive groves that had been in his family for generations, and a chain of gourmet food stores we built together from nothing. I poured every drop of my energy into keeping it all alive, not just for me, but for the hundreds of workers whose families depended on it. My daughter, Isabella, was all I had left in terms of close family. At least, that's what I told myself. She'd married Marco 6 years earlier, a man with movie star looks and the kind of oily charm that could make a snake oil salesman look like a saint. At first, I wanted to believe he loved her, maybe even respected me. But as time wore on, I saw the way his eyes lingered on the expensive bottles of wine in my cellar, the way he'd ask overly casual questions about my will, the way Isabella started dressing in designer clothes she'd never worn when her father was alive. Still, I told myself they were young, enjoying life. I was too exhausted from my own battles to start another war with family. Then Antonio appeared. I remember that night so clearly it feels like a scene etched in crystal. I'd been invited to a charity gala at the Museo de Bellas Arts by an old friend from university. It was one of those crisp spring nights when the air feels like silk and the city smells faintly of orange blossoms. I arrived in my emerald evening gown, one of Javier's favorites, and was greeted by the warm glow of chandeliers and the low hum of cultured conversation. I was at the buffet table, sampling a slice of manchego, when I felt a light tap on my shoulder. "Pardon, señora," a voice like warm honey said, but I couldn't help noticing. "You look like you stepped straight out of a portrait." I turned, and there he was. Tall, salt and pepper hair swept back effortlessly, dark eyes that seemed to drink me in. Antonio. He claimed he was an art dealer from Madrid, in Valencia for a short time, and somehow, in the span of minutes, we were talking like we'd known each other for years. He knew wine, he knew food, he knew the right balance between compliment and curiosity. It was flattering, intoxicating even, to have a man look at me like I was the only thing worth noticing in a room full of glittering people. We bumped into each other twice more that week, once at my favorite cafe, once during my morning run along the Turia Gardens. At first I thought it was coincidence. Looking back now, I see how perfectly staged it was, like a play with just enough improvisation to keep the audience believing. Antonio had a way of making the world feel smaller, more intimate. He'd touch my elbow lightly as we crossed the street, remember small details I'd mentioned in passing, send me photos of art pieces with captions like, "This reminds me of you." And for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me, a dangerous little bloom of hope. He began joining me for dinners at my home where he'd charm my staff and pour wine like a man who truly appreciated it. We'd talk late into the night, and though there was always an undercurrent of flirtation, there was also something deeper, or so I thought. He asked about my life, my work, and when I described the exhausting balancing act of managing multiple businesses, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Marisol," he said one evening, "you've given so much of your life to work. You should be enjoying it. Let the people you trust take over the hard parts." I laughed then, not realizing that those words were the first stones being laid in the trap. "And who would that be?" I teased. "My daughter? My son-in-law?" His smile was so slight I almost missed it. "Family is the most natural choice. They love you. They'll protect what you've built." He was smooth, I'll give him that. Never pushy, always planting seeds with the gentlest of touches. And because I was lonely, because part of me wanted to believe in romance again, I let them take root. But then small things started to nag at me. The way Antonio's phone would light up with messages he quickly turned face down. The faint cologne on his jacket that wasn't mine. the way Isabella's attitude toward him shifted from polite to almost conspiratorial, as if they'd developed some private understanding. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe in this man, to believe that at 55 I could still be desired for something more than my bank account. What I didn't know then was that the two people I should have been able to trust most had already decided I was nothing more than a mark. And Antonio? He was their hired weapon, dressed up in charm and pretending to be my salvation. I didn't know it yet, but the real game was about to begin. And when it did, they would learn that I am not the kind of woman you take for a fool and walk away unscathed.
Marco always had a way of smiling without ever letting it reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile a predator gives before the kill, polished, polite, and utterly soulless. If I'd been paying closer attention in those early days with Antonio, I might have seen the smug little glances Marco would exchange with Isabella whenever Antonio's name came up. But I was busy being flattered, busy convincing myself that it was finally my turn to live a little. After years of keeping my businesses afloat, I wanted to believe that love had walked into my life, dressed in an expensive suit and smelling faintly of bergamot. The first time Antonio met Isabella and Marco was at a dinner I hosted in the sunroom of my villa. The vines outside were heavy with grapes, and the last gold light of summer spilled through the glass like honey. I remember fussing over the seating, wanting everyone to feel at ease. Antonio arrived with a bottle of Grand Reserva from 1990, presenting it like an offering at an altar. Isabella cooed over it, her voice just a touch too high-pitched, the way she spoke when she wanted to impress. Marco, on the other hand, played it cool, complimenting Antonio's choice of wine, asking a few questions about the art world, but never letting go of that little predator smile. That night, after they left, Antonio leaned across the table, took my hand, and said, "You have a beautiful family." I didn't know then that those words were less an observation and more a declaration of conquest. From then on, Antonio seemed to accidentally cross paths with Marco. I'd find out days later that they'd been at the same golf course or spotted together at a cigar lounge. When I'd ask Antonio about it, he'd wave it off with that charming grin. Valencia is a small world, mi amor. But the coincidences piled up. One afternoon, I walked into my own office to find Antonio chatting easily with my head accountant, a man who has been with me since Javier's father ran the vineyards. Antonio claimed he was there to surprise me, but I couldn't shake the flicker of unease. What business did he have discussing finances with my staff? Still, I told myself not to be suspicious. After all, wasn't I the one who invited him into my world? The cracks in my blind trust began to widen during a weekend trip Antonio whisked me away on. We stayed at a secluded villa on the coast, the kind of place where the sea stretched out forever and the walls were thick enough to keep the world away. Over dinner one night, he poured me another glass of wine and began steering the conversation toward my work again. "Marisol," he said softly, "you deserve more than stress and late nights. Why not let your daughter and Marco take over? You could still have a say, of course, but you'd be free to travel, to enjoy life with me." The suggestion landed heavier this time. I asked him what made him so sure they could handle it. And he smiled. "They're young, ambitious, and they love you. Trust is the foundation of family." He leaned back, eyes holding mine as if daring me to disagree. It was such a subtle push, so wrapped in tenderness, that I almost didn't see it for what it was, a test. And I failed it, at least in his eyes, because I didn't argue. I nodded, smiled, and let him think the seed was sprouting. But in truth, I was starting to water my own. It was a week later when I caught the first undeniable sign that something was off. I'd gone into town earlier than usual and was sitting at a cafe near the Mercado Central when I saw them, Antonio and Marco, walking together, deep in conversation. I watched them from behind the shelter of my sunglasses as Marco handed Antonio something small and rectangular, which Antonio slipped quickly into his jacket pocket. They didn't see me. I stayed seated long after they disappeared around the corner, my coffee gone cold, my mind replaying every little coincidence between them. That night, I didn't say a word to Antonio when he came over. I smiled, I poured wine, I let him think he was still in control. But a quiet part of me was shifting, realigning. I began to listen more carefully to his stories, to note the small inconsistencies. His art dealer business trips always seemed to take him to places Marco had recently visited. His compliments started to feel rehearsed, his concern just a little too polished. And every time he brought up handing over my responsibilities to Isabella and Marco, I filed the words away like pieces of evidence in an invisible case. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I had been married to a man who'd survived in a business full of sharks. Javier had taught me that power wasn't in the blow you landed, but in the patience to wait until your opponent's guard was completely down. And so, I waited. I let Antonio believe he was weaving his spell tighter around me. I let Marco think he'd found the perfect way to separate me from my fortune without getting his own hands dirty. They were playing a game they thought I didn't even know existed. But the truth was, the board had been set long before they made their first move. And every step they took toward what they thought was victory was only bringing them closer to the kind of loss they couldn't recover from.
The day Antonio suggested we take a trip to Madrid, just the two of us, was the day I decided to stop wondering and start acting. By then, the coincidences had become a rhythm. Antonio showing up at my businesses unannounced, Marco asking me questions about my retirement plans with that faux concern dripping off his words. Isabella suddenly speaking as though she understood vineyard operations after years of avoiding the fields entirely. Madrid, Antonio told me, would be a chance for us to escape the noise and dream about the future. What he didn't know was that my future dreaming had shifted entirely, from romantic dinners and lazy mornings to carefully planned revenge. We stayed in a boutique hotel near the Prado, all charm and old-world glamour. He played the attentive lover, booking a private tour of the museum, surprising me with tickets to a flamenco performance, leaning in close as if every word I spoke was worth keeping forever. And yet, every time I excused myself to freshen up, I caught him on the phone. Low voice, clipped words, an edge in his tone that vanished the second he saw me. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the bedside table. The message preview was from Marco. "She's opening up. Keep pushing. The papers will be ready soon." My chest tightened, not with heartbreak, but with the cold, clear confirmation I had been waiting for. I snapped a photo of the message with my own phone, tucked it away like a playing card I would lay on the table later. I didn't confront him, not yet. Confrontation would only spook him, and a spooked con man is dangerous. Instead, I leaned into my role, smiling more, laughing at his jokes, agreeing when he brought up the idea of me stepping back from work. "Maybe you're right," I told him one night over dinner, swirling a glass of Rioja. "Maybe it's time I let Isabella and Marco take over. They are family, after all." His smile was like watching a snake uncoil in the sun. Slow, satisfied, certain of the meal ahead. When we returned to Valencia, Antonio seemed bolder. He began dropping in on Isabella and Marco openly, suggesting family dinners where the four of us would sit together while they painted this beautiful picture of my golden years. Me traveling with Antonio, them running the businesses. Isabella, my own daughter, looked me in the eye and said, "Mama, you've done enough. Let us take care of things now." Her tone was tender, her smile warm, but her fingers tightened around her wineglass just a little too much. I wanted to laugh right then, but I bit it back. Instead, I began my preparations. I called my lawyer, an old friend of Javier's who knew the value of silence and precision. We spent hours drafting what would look like property transfer documents, elegant, official, and exactly what Antonio and Marco thought they wanted. But hidden in the fine print were clauses that would not only prevent them from ever accessing my fortune, but also immediately revoke any power of attorney or signatory rights they might already hold. If they signed or even presented these papers, they'd be sealing their own exclusion from my estate forever. I also began moving certain assets quietly, liquidating some holdings, transferring vineyard shares to trusts under my godchildren's names, and placing the olive groves under a corporate entity with only me as the controlling officer. Everything was done so quietly that neither Antonio nor Marco could see it happening because on the surface, I was still the picture of a besotted woman ready to hand over her world for love. Antonio kept up his performance beautifully. He took me to dinners, sent flowers, whispered about the life we'd have once I was free of all the stress.
And Marco played his role too, gracious, supportive, slipping in little reminders about how smoothly things would run with him at the helm. If they noticed that I was asking more questions about their plans, their vision for the businesses, they probably thought I was simply making peace with my decision. But in reality, I was mapping the full extent of their greed, tracing its shape so I could crush it all at once. The final push came one evening when Antonio, over dessert at my villa, produced a sleek leather folder. "The first drafts," he said smoothly. "Marco's lawyer put these together, just to make things easier when you're ready." I took the folder, opened it, and let my eyes scan the pages. These weren't even subtle. They stripped me of ownership of nearly everything: vineyards, groves, stores, and handed them over to a family management group controlled entirely by Marco and Isabella. Antonio watched me carefully as I closed the folder. I smiled, set it aside, and said, "Let me think about it, Kitty, though. Big decisions deserve a little time." He relaxed instantly, mistaking my patience for hesitation instead of the victory it truly was. That night, in the privacy of my study, I placed the fake transfer documents my lawyer and I had prepared into an identical leather folder. I left it in the drawer where Antonio knew I kept important papers. It was only a matter of time before he suggested I sign them to make things official. And when that moment came, I would be ready, not just to sign, but to end the game entirely. They thought they were circling a vulnerable widow, fat with wealth and starved for affection. But I had been watching them circle for months, and soon it would be my turn to pounce.
It was a Wednesday evening when the whole rotten core of their plan cracked open in front of me. The rain had been falling in lazy, unhurried sheets all day, the kind that makes the world smell like wet earth and old stone. Antonio had told me he'd be working late at his gallery downtown, which immediately set my instincts buzzing. I decided to follow the quiet itch at the back of my mind. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was certainty dressed in patience. I waited until after dark, pulled on a trench coat, and took the side streets into the heart of the city. Antonio's gallery was closed when I passed it, the metal shutter drawn, but his car wasn't parked anywhere nearby. That was my first confirmation. I called a taxi and told the driver to take me to the address I'd seen on one of Marco's business cards. His private office, the one he never mentioned in family conversations. The building was mostly dark, save for a dim glow seeping from the frosted glass of the third floor. My shoes barely made a sound as I climbed the stairs, and when I reached the landing, I froze. Their voices were clear through the thin walls, as though the rain outside had decided to hush itself to listen in. "She's close," Marco was saying, his tone smug and oily. "A few more weeks, maybe less. Once she signs, everything's ours." "And you're sure the papers will hold up?" Antonio's voice was lower, edged with greed. Marco laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Of course, my lawyer's handled bigger transfers. She won't have a cent to her name unless we give it to her." There was the sound of something sliding across a table, then Marco again. "Here's the last payment. You've done well. I didn't think you'd have heard this hooked so quickly." "She was easier than I expected," Antonio replied, and there was a pause, long enough for me to imagine the smirk on his face before he added, "A lonely woman will believe anything if you say it's sweet enough." My fingers curled into fists in my palms, nails digging half-moons into my palms. The urge to burst in and end it right there was like fire in my chest. But fire burns fast, and I wanted something slow, something that would leave nothing but ashes on their side of the board. I slipped back down the stairs without a sound, the echo of their laughter following me out into the rain. By the time I reached home, my plan had shifted from cautious to absolute. They weren't going to just lose their chance at my fortune, they were going to lose every advantage they thought they had over me. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told him it was time. We went over every line of the fake transfer documents again, ensuring the trap was ironclad. Once signed, the papers would not only void any attempt to transfer my assets, but also trigger a cascade of legal safeguards, trusts locked beyond challenge, property titles fortified, and even a clause that would alert the bank to freeze any joint accounts Marco or Isabella had access to that were linked to my businesses. The brilliance of it was in its simplicity. They would think they had won, walk away with what they believed were the keys to the kingdom, and then discover the doors not only locked, but bricked over entirely. I began playing my role more convincingly than ever. Over dinners, I'd sigh about my aching back from vineyard work, hint at wanting to wake up somewhere far away without thinking about payroll. Antonio would squeeze my hand, Marco would nod solemnly, and Isabella would beam like a child about to unwrap her biggest birthday gift.
Inside, I could barely contain the anticipation. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Antonio arrived at the villa one evening with a fresh folder. "It's all ready, mi amor," he said, setting it on the table between us. "Once you sign, we can start planning our real life." I pretended to hesitate, my fingers hovering over the leather before I pulled it toward me. "If we're doing this," I said softly, "let's make it official now. I don't want to wait anymore." His eyes lit up, and I could almost see the numbers running through his head. My numbers, my life's work, everything he thought was about to become his. I excused myself to the study, telling him I wanted my special pen. Instead, I switched the folder for the one with my lawyer's carefully crafted trap. When I returned, I signed each page with deliberate care, pressing just hard enough to leave the faintest imprint, the way Javier used to when he signed the most important contracts. Antonio watched every stroke, probably imagining the ink drying over the death certificate of my independence. When it was done, I slid the folder across to him and smiled. "There, it's your turn now," he chuckled, closing the folder without even looking. "Don't worry, I'll take care of the rest." I nodded, my face the perfect mask of trust. Inside, I was already picturing the morning he and Marco would wake up to discover their accounts frozen, their influence gone, their plan obliterated before it even began. And when that morning came, I promised myself I would be there to see the look on their faces.
I didn't have to wait long for the first tremor to hit them. It was 2 days after I'd signed the transfer papers. A morning painted in that crisp gold light that makes Valencia's streets look like something out of a postcard. I was in my kitchen with a cup of strong cafe solo when my phone buzzed with a number I knew by heart, Marco's. I let it ring twice before answering, my tone all sleepy warmth. "Marco, what a surprise." What came through the line wasn't surprise. It was panic, dressed poorly as irritation. "Marisol, there's some, issue with the bank. They've frozen our joint operational accounts. The vineyard's payroll is—" He cut himself off, like the rest of the sentence might betray more than he wanted to. I let my brows knit just enough to sell the concern. "That's odd. Have you spoken to the bank?" "Yes," he snapped, "but they said something about updated legal filings, new trustees." He stopped again, his tone shifting into suspicion. "You didn't make any changes, did you?" "Me?" I gave a light laugh, the kind that says, how could I possibly know about such things? "Marco, you know I leave all the technical stuff to you." That silence on the other end was delicious, confused, simmering, but still hopeful enough that he couldn't quite tip over into rage. "I'll handle it," he muttered, then hung up. An hour later, I got a text from Antonio. "We need to talk tonight. Urgent." I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I went about my day exactly as planned, visiting the groves, walking the rows of silver-green trees, letting the workers greet me with the same warmth they'd shown since Javier's time. These were my people, my legacy, the lifeblood Marco and Isabella thought they could snatch like a wallet off a distracted tourist. That evening, Antonio showed up without the easy smile, without the careful cologne, without the patience. "Something's wrong," he said as soon as I opened the door. "Marco says the transfer isn't recognized. The accounts are locked. The properties still list you as sole owner. What happened?" I feigned confusion so flawlessly it should have won awards. "Antonio, that's impossible. We signed the documents, didn't we?" "Yes, but—" His eyes narrowed. "You didn't give me the wrong folder, did you?" That was my cue to lean into the perfect wounded act. "Wrong folder? Do you think I'm that careless? Or," I let my voice crack just enough, "do you think I'd trick you?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The storm in his gaze told me exactly how far the panic had seeped in. "Maybe it's just processing," I offered gently. "Banks and registries take time." That flicker of hope was back, but smaller now, dimmer. "Maybe," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Over the next week, I let them stew. I knew they were making calls, pushing their lawyers, leaning on contacts in the registry. But every inquiry they made only led them deeper into the maze my lawyer had built, a maze with no exit. On the seventh day, the real cracks began to show. Isabella called me herself, her voice sharp enough to slice glass. "Mama, did you change the vineyard trusts? Marco says there are new beneficiaries." I took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Oh, you mean the godchildren?" "Yes, I thought it was time to honor old promises. Why?" The silence that followed was everything I had worked for. Shock, laced with fury. The sound of someone realizing the walls they thought they'd built around your life were actually their own prison. "Why?" she hissed. "Because you've tied up assets that—" I interrupted softly. "Assets that belong to me. I've been very generous, Isabella, but generosity isn't the same as surrender." I could hear her breath quicken, the edge of a sob or a scream hovering just out of reach. She hung up without another word. That same night, I got another visit from Antonio. He didn't knock politely this time. He pounded on the heavy oak door until I opened it. "You set us up," he said flatly. There was no pretense left now. No soft voice, no warm eyes, just a man stripped of his performance, angry and desperate. "You set me up?" I tilted my head, keeping my tone calm. "Antonio, I didn't hire you to pretend to love me. I didn't pay you to convince me to hand over my life. I didn't plot with my son-in-law to bleed me dry. That was all you." His jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." I smiled then, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that Javier once told me could unnerve even the boldest negotiator. "No, Kitty, though. I regret nothing. You, however—" I let the sentence dangle, heavy with the promise of what was still to come. The next morning, their nightmare deepened. Not only were all my businesses locked under my sole control, but the small stream of funds I'd been quietly giving Isabella and Marco each month had been severed. Their credit cards were declined. The luxury SUV? Repossessed. The penthouse? Eviction notice served. The game was no longer in play. It was over. But they hadn't realized just how much further I intended to take it.
The calls from Marco came less frequent after that, but when they did, the desperation in his voice was like a fine wine to me, rich, layered, impossible to fake. I didn't answer most of them. Instead, I let him leave voicemails, each one more frantic than the last, the polished arrogance stripped away until all that was left was a man grasping at a rope that had already slipped from his hands. By now, the ripples of their downfall had started to spread through Valencia's social circles. The same people who'd once gushed over Isabella's dresses and Marco's imported cigars were now whispering over tapas about the sudden bankruptcy, the rumors of unpaid debts, the suggestion that maybe the son-in-law wasn't the savvy businessman he pretended to be. I didn't have to feed the gossip. It grew on its own, like mold in the dark. All I did was make sure the right people saw what I wanted them to see. At a charity luncheon, I arrived in a tailored cream suit, hair swept into a low chignon, and made a quiet donation to a scholarship fund for vineyard workers' children. Inevitably, someone asked about Isabella and Marco. I simply smiled and said, "Oh, I think they're recalibrating their priorities." The phrase spread like wildfire, each retelling sharpening it into something closer to the truth. Antonio was nowhere to be seen in public with them now, and I suspected his usefulness to Marco had expired the moment the trap closed. But I wasn't done with Antonio yet. You see, revenge isn't just about removing someone's power, it's about removing the mask they hide behind. And Antonio's mask was that of a man of refinement, an art dealer, a gentleman. I had a friend in Madrid who dealt in high-value acquisitions, real ones, unlike Antonio's supposed gallery. And with a few carefully phrased inquiries, I was able to confirm what I already suspected. Antonio had never held a legitimate gallery in his life. His business was a front for a string of short cons, romance scams, and small-scale art forgeries. Armed with this, I made a single anonymous call to a journalist at a lifestyle magazine known for its behind-the-curtain exposés. 2 weeks later, the front page bore a photo of Antonia leaving a police station in Madrid, the headline screaming about the gentleman art dealer who wasn't. His face was everywhere, but not in the way he liked. As for Marco and Isabella, their fall from grace was even more satisfying to watch. Without my money propping them up, their debts came calling fast. The penthouse furniture, so carefully curated for their Instagram posts, was sold off piece by piece to cover overdue bills. The luxury SUV was replaced by a second-hand compact car that coughed smoke on cold mornings. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Isabella had started applying for jobs, real jobs, but her name had become a stain in certain circles, the whispers of, she tried to swindle her own mother, trailing her like perfume gone rancid. The final act came at the annual Vineyard Gala, a tradition Javier and I had started decades ago. It was the event of the season, wine tastings under strings of lights, music drifting through the air, and every major figure in Valencia's wine industry in attendance. I sent an invitation to Isabella and Marco, not because I wanted them there, but because I wanted them to see what they'd tried to take from me. Still standing, still mine. They arrived late, of course, dressed as well as they could manage now, but I could see the difference in the cut of Marco's suit, the cheapness of Isabella's jewelry. When they approached, I greeted them warmly, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Isabella, Marco, so glad you could make it. I was just telling everyone about the new expansion. We're adding another 20 acres to the vineyard next year. I watched their eyes flicker to the people around us, saw the realization that they were no longer part of this world, not in the way they once were, that they were outsiders now, clinging to a party they'd been quietly disinvited from months ago. Later that night, as the last of the guests were leaving, Marco tried to pull me aside. His voice was low, urgent. Marisol, we can fix this. We can find a way back. I met his gaze, steady and calm. There's no way back, Marco. You made sure of that the moment you sent Antonio into my life. I let the words sink in. Let him see there was no negotiation, no mercy left to barter for. He nodded once sharply and walked away, Isabella trailing behind him with her head down. The image stayed with me, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. They tried to make me a victim in my own story, but all they'd done was hand me the pen to write their ending.
The weeks after the gala were quiet in the way late summer evenings are. Warm light stretching long across the vineyard rows, cicadas singing like they'd been paid for the performance. It should have been a time for rest, for letting the season's work ripen on its own, but my mind was restless, circling the events like a hawk that's already made its kill but isn't ready to fly away. Revenge had been intoxicating, yes, delicious in its precision, satisfying in its completeness, but there's something they never tell you about winning a war you didn't start. When the noise fades, you're left with the echo of the betrayal, and the echo is quieter, but somehow heavier. I'd grown up believing family was a fortress. That belief had carried me through my marriage, through raising Isabella, through the years when Javier and I were building everything from the soil up. But now, standing on my terrace with a glass of deep red in hand, I understood that a fortress only works if the people inside aren't the ones lighting the matches. I didn't miss Marco. He'd never been more than a handsome shadow on Isabella's arm, a shadow I'd tolerated for her sake. But Isabella, that was different. Her betrayal had a different texture, a different sting. Every lie she told, every time she smiled at me while knowing Antonio was in on the game, it chipped away at something deeper than money could touch. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to erase her entirely from my life. Not yet. Cutting her off financially had been easy. Cutting her out of my heart was harder. I started walking the vineyard more often. Sometimes at dawn, when the air was still cool. Sometimes in the last light before dusk. The workers, many of whom had known me since I was a young bride, would nod respectfully. But I saw their curiosity in their eyes. They knew something had happened. They didn't ask, but they knew. One morning as I was checking the vines, my foreman, Miguel, approached me with a bottle in hand. "From the '98 harvest," he said, holding it out like an offering, "your husband's favorite year. I thought you might want to open it tonight." The cork smelled like earth and memory. I thanked him,
And later that night, I poured myself a glass and sat alone in the study, the fire casting slow shadows on the walls. I thought about Javier, about the way he'd always trusted my instincts in business. He used to say, "Marisol, you can't stop snakes from slithering near the vines, but you can make sure they never survive the season." I smiled at that, realizing I had done exactly what he would have done, protected the harvest, not just for me, but for the generations to come. But there was still the matter of Antonio. I'd taken away his payday, ruined his name in the art circles, but I hadn't given him the final consequence. That came 2 months later, on an unremarkable Tuesday. Through a contact in Madrid, I learned Antonio had taken a job at a tourist bar along the coast, charming strangers for tips. I made the trip quietly, unannounced. The bar was exactly as I expected. Plastic chairs, watered-down cocktails, the smell of sunscreen and desperation hanging in the air. And there he was, in a white shirt rolled to the elbows, smiling at a table of vacationing women as if the past year hadn't happened. He didn't see me first. I waited until his table cleared, then stepped forward. His smile faltered the moment our eyes met. "Marisol," he said, and my name sounded brittle in his mouth. "I came to thank you," I said simply. He frowned. "Thank me?" "Yes," I replied, "because without you, I might have gone another 10 years believing my daughter's loyalty was unshakable. I might have never locked my life's work as tightly as I have now. You were the test I didn't know I needed, and you failed spectacularly." He didn't respond, just stood there, gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only solid thing in his world. I left without another word, the sound of the sea swallowing whatever curses he might have thrown after me. Back in Valencia, the air felt different, lighter. My revenge was complete, not because I'd taken everything from them, but because I'd left them with nothing they could use to rebuild the illusions they had lived on. Marco and Isabella were no longer part of the city's social fabric. Antonio was no longer a man of refinement. And well, I still had my vineyards, my groves, my stores, and my name. Most importantly, I had my freedom. And in the quiet of my home, with the fire low and the wine rich on my tongue, I realized that freedom was worth more than all of it.
The first autumn after it all ended arrived like a slow exhale, the kind that releases something you didn't realize you'd been holding for months. The vineyard shifted from lush green to a patchwork of gold and rust, and the olive groves took on that silvery shimmer they get when the air cools. Harvest season was always my favorite, busy, alive, humming with the rhythm of picking, pressing, bottling. But that year felt different, lighter, safer, mine. I walked the rows every morning, running my fingers over the grape clusters. And for the first time in years, I didn't wonder what would happen if I wasn't here. I didn't have to. Everything was locked so tightly in place that even if I disappeared tomorrow, it would pass into the hands of people who valued it, not vultures who only saw its worth in cash. My workers smiled more now. I think they'd sensed the tension before, even if they didn't know the details. Miguel stopped me one afternoon as I was inspecting the presses. "It's good to see you happy again, Senora," he said, simple and sincere. I thanked him, but part of me wanted to tell him it wasn't happiness exactly. It was peace. And peace is quieter, but far more precious. Isabella didn't try to contact me again after the gala. At first, that absence stung. She was my daughter, after all, and some foolish part of me thought there might be an apology buried in her somewhere. But months passed, and the silence became its own answer. I stopped expecting her voice on the other end of the line. I stopped wondering if Marco was still in the picture. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. One evening, I sat on the terrace with a glass of 98, watching the sun melt into the horizon, and I let myself think about what I'd learned. People will tell you that betrayal teaches you to harden your heart, but that's only half the truth. It teaches you to be deliberate about who you open it to, and to yourself most of all.
I had been so focused on surviving after Javier's death that I forgot to live for me. That was what Antonio had really stolen, more than any money or property. The years I might have spent remembering my own worth. But here, now, I had taken it back. In small ways, I started saying yes to things I'd always put off. I traveled to the coast with old friends. I took a pottery class just to feel clay between my hands again. I hosted long, laughter-filled dinners under the vines, inviting the people who'd stood by me quietly through the storm. And I found that joy wasn't something you wait for, it's something you build, just like a vineyard, one deliberate choice at a time. One crisp October afternoon, I opened a letter from a local women's association asking me to speak at a fundraiser about financial independence. They'd heard about what happened, though I knew they didn't have the details. I hesitated for a moment, then smiled. I'd tell them enough to matter, not the gossip, but the truth, that age, love, and trust are not weaknesses, and that protecting what's yours is not selfish, it's survival. As the months rolled on, I sometimes caught my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because I'd changed into someone new, but because I'd finally come back to myself. I was no longer the widow scraping to hold the pieces together, nor the lonely woman hoping romance could fill the cracks. I was simply Marisol Vega, owner of vineyards that would outlive me, guardian of my own story. And if I'm honest, that is the sweetest revenge of all. Not the ruin I left behind for Marco, Isabella, and Antonio, but the life I refused to let them take from me. So if you're listening to this, if you've been burned by the people you thought would protect you, I want you to remember something. You are never too old, too kind, or too trusting to stand up and take your power back. You can lose money, property, even relationships. But if you keep yourself, you can rebuild everything else. That's my story, and it's one I hope you never have to live. But if you do, may you come out of it not just standing, but smiling. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories like mine, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your voice, because you never know who your words might help find their way back to themselves.